Okay, so hello. This is my reflection on week 3, which we looked at something called informal assessment. And yet, I think from the term, it appears to be, just right off the bat looking at the term, it appears to be less significant than the formative and summative types, especially because it doesn't necessarily go into a grade. However, I actually believe that this can potentially be the most telling in a number of ways. So from the readings, I noted that it's a way to gather data by watching behaviors, event, or noting physical characteristics in their natural setting. So real-time observations. It's kind of like a think on your feet thing in the way I look at it. Um, for when should observations be used? It's to try to understand an ongoing process or situation, gathering data on individual behaviors and interaction between people, and it's the information on the physical setting. Something interesting that I noticed while reading was in the section for activity participation inventory, and I'm not sure if I totally understood it correctly, but for the part that had the access barriers and the motoric barriers, it basically spoke to me in a way where the work that students produce doesn't always measure their lack of understanding and engagement in the content. So, two examples I can give you of how I thought of it or understood it was, for example, in my case study, I used the name Josiah. Um, he has low self esteem, so he can't produce always the work that he feels capable of. I mean, even today, I kind of went up to him. We were working on an assignment, and he was like, "Oh, I'm bad at drawing," because there was some sort of drawing component to it, even though it was more so on the writing. And yet, in real time, I noticed that he's so engaged in the book. He can speak to me really anything that we are talking about in class. When I talk to him one on one, and when I get him comfortable, and I'm able to connect with him, but his work doesn't always reflect that side of him. Another example I can give you, which is more, I think, pertinent to actually what someone's physically capable of, or necessarily, what's within their reach. Um, there's a student, I'll use the name Yusuf, who has an IEP and special learning needs. And he's also was an ENL student, which was Arabic. So even the way he writes, because the alphabetic systems are different, he doesn't necessarily write in the neatest or the most complete sentences. Yet he too, I notice every time we have a class discussion about the book, he's like always raising his hand. In fact, he's the most likely to participate every classroom discussion, and he always has really insightful things to say. So there's ways you can learn about what a student is getting and what a student understands, that's separate from the work that they produce and the way they're being assessed in a formative or a summative kind of way. Um, I also find that informal assessment shares somewhat of a similarity to formative assessment in the sense where you use it to inform your teaching practices. I can give you an example. One period I taught a lesson and had the students give events taking place in The Outsiders for the bell ringer, which is the story we are reading. This eventually would build up to a comic strip assignment, a formative assessment, which required them to put the events in chronological order. And there were some other things we did with it, with tone and things like that. But one of the class periods, I noted that students misunderstood that I was writing the events that students were telling me in chronological order when they were actually in the order that students raised their hand and provided the event. So, like, I had the bell ringer list 5 major events so far, and I had students raise their hand and give me one. So I wrote on the board in the order that they were telling me. What happened was they misunderstood, as I realized that when I went around and observed that students were putting them in the order on the board rather than sequentially, and when a student asked me a question about whether they were in order or not, I realized that they thought what I was putting on the board was the order that it was happening in the book. And one student even said to me, like, oh, I thought this happened before this, and I had to clarify that. So the next period, I made sure to put the events on the board in the order that they happened and not in the order that they were stated. So when a student would raise their hand, I'd kind of leave myself enough space to stick a few in there. And this is just one of the many takeaways from this week. I think this is the most important one because it combined my practice and my learning. I spoke to and observed from my teaching mentor about informal assessment as well, and he basically said that I modeled what he does, which was actually pretty awesome to hear, and it shows how useful my coursework is in the classroom. He actually jokingly had replied to me saying that we always say that the last period of the day gets the best lesson, because you are constantly modifying it as you notice what things students struggle with or misunderstand in real time as each period progresses. The one criticism I do have that is in the Danielson framework, it states in the highly effective rubric for designing assessments that, and I'll read this word for word, all the instructional outcomes may be assessed by the proposed assessment plan with clear criteria for assessing students' work. The plan contains evidence of students' contribution to its development. Assessment methodologies have been adapted for individual students as the need has arisen. The approach to using formative assessment is well designed and includes student as well as the teacher use of the assessment information. Um, I haven't noticed my mentor teacher give any rubrics out or anything like that, which I obviously um, isn't really in the criteria for the Danielson framework, and I would argue against. But I think also the problem is we are expected to use district-wide assessments, which I don't always think are pertinent to what we are doing in class. So it's hard to kind of find that middle ground, especially because each teacher designs their assessments differently and has students work on different assignments to measure their learning. But there's a one-size-fits-all box for all writing assignments with the district assessments that we are using, and it weighs things in ways that I wouldn't necessarily assess myself. For example, we work a lot in class on citing textual evidence, yet in the district assessment, it holds citing evidence holds the same weight as command of grammar and conventions. So it's like, if a student doesn't have the best grammar and I have to dock some points off on the rubric, and it holds the same weight as them effectively being able to cite textual evidence, making inferences, which is something we do a lot in class. We don't really work on grammar in class. Then I think that's a little bit unfair. Um, so that's just a criticism I have of my observations in the classroom and from reviewing the Danielson framework. But other than that, I thought that this was a really interesting week in general. It's good to actually pinpoint and define what informal assessment is because it's very telling and it's very useful. Uh, it's basically adapting and thinking on your feet as a teacher to modify things in real time for students, and that's very important. Um, yeah, so that's just about it. Have a great night.